Hello, this is video lecture number 73. Today we are looking at politics in the 1920s. Our subsections today are women in politics, Republican normalcy, dollar diplomacy, and culture wars. There's a lot to cover today, so we are just going to dive right in with that very first subsection, women in politics. So at the start of the 1920s, many progressive women hoped that the achievement of full voting rights would offer women new leverage to tackle industrial poverty. They created new organizations like the Women's Joint Congressional Committee, which was a Washington-based advocacy group. The committee's greatest accomplishment was the first federally funded health care legislation, which was the Shepard-Towner Federal Maternity and Infancy Act of 1921. Shepard-Towner provided federal funds to subsidize medical clinics, prenatal education programs, and visiting nurses. Though opponents warned that the act would lead to socialized medicine, Shepard-Towner improved health care for the poor and significantly lowered infant mortality rates. It also marked the first time that Congress designated federal funds to states and encouraged them to administer a social welfare program. Moved by the immense scale of suffering caused by World War I, some women joined a growing international peace movement. Treaty makers ignored them, but the activists organized for sustained opposition to war. In 1919, they created the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom, the WILPF, whose leading members included Jane Addams. Through the 1920s and beyond, the League denounced imperialism, proposed social justice measures, and stressed the suffering caused by militarism. Despite such work, women's activism suffered major setbacks in the 1920s. The WILPF came under fierce attack during the Red Scare, based on the presence of socialist women among its ranks. Many congressmen initially supported the Shepard-Towner Act because they feared the voting power of women, but by the late 1920s, Congress ended the program. Though women proved to be effective lobbyists, they had difficulty gaining access to posts in the Republican and Democratic parties. Finding that women did not vote as a bloc, politicians in both parties began to take their votes for granted. Okay, let's move to the next section then, Republican normalcy. With President Wilson ailing in 1920, Democrats nominated Governor James M. Cox of Ohio for president, calling on a platform for U.S. participation in the League of Nations and a continuation of Wilson's progressivism. Republicans, led by their pro-business wing, tapped genial Ohio Senator Warren G. Harding. In a dig at Wilson's sweeping idealism, Harding promised not nostrums, but normalcy. On Election Day, he won in a landslide, beginning an era of Republican dominance that lasted until 1932. Harding's most energetic appointee was Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. Under Hoover's direction, the Commerce Department helped to create 2,000 trade associations representing companies in almost every major industry. Government officials worked closely with these associations, providing statistical research, suggesting industry-wide standards, and promoting stable prices and wages. Hoover hoped that through voluntary business cooperation with government, what he called an associated state, he could achieve what progressive reformers had sought through governmental regulation. When President Harding died suddenly of a heart attack in August of 1923, evidence was just coming to light that parts of his administration were riddled with corruption. The worst scandal concerned the secret leasing of government oil reserves in Teapot Dome, Wyoming, and Elk Hills, California, to private companies. Assuming office after Harding's death, President Calvin Coolidge maintained Republican dominance while offering a contrast to his predecessor's cronyism. Campaigning in 1924, then, Coolidge called for limited government. He called for isolation in foreign policy and also tax cuts for business. Rural and urban Democrats were deeply divided over such issues as prohibition and immigration restriction. They found themselves deadlocked then at their national convention. Their delegates cast 102 ballots before finally choosing John W. Davis, a Wall Street lawyer. Coolidge easily defeated Davis and staved off a challenge by Senator Robert La Follette of Wisconsin, who tried to resuscitate the Progressive Party. In the end, Coolidge received 15.7 million votes to Davis's 8.4 million and La Follette's 4.9 million. For the most part, Republicans declined to carry forward progressive initiatives from the pre-war years. The Republican-dominated Federal Trade Commission, known as the FTC, failed to enforce antitrust laws. With the agricultural sector also facing hardship, Congress sought to aid the farmers with the McNary-Haugen bills of 1927 and 28, which proposed a system of federal price supports for major crops. But President Coolidge opposed the bills as special interest legislation, and he vetoed them both. Okay, let's go to the next section then, dollar diplomacy. Political campaigns emphasized domestic issues in the 1920s. But the United States nonetheless remained deeply engaged in foreign affairs. The Harding, Coolidge, and Hoover administrations all sought to advance U.S. business interests, especially by encouraging private banks to make foreign loans. They hoped such loans would stimulate growth and increase demand for U.S. products in developing markets. In 1922, when American banks offered an immense loan to Bolivia, at a hefty profit, the State Department pressured Bolivia to accept it. It also forced Bolivia to agree to financial oversight by a commission under the bank's control. A similar arrangement was reached with El Salvador's government in 1923, though efforts to broker such deals in Honduras and Guatemala fell through. Where stronger action was needed, the United States intervened militarily, often to force repayment of debt. The U.S. Marines occupied Nicaragua continuously from 1912 to 1933, the Dominican Republic from 1916 to 24, and Haiti from 1915 to 1934. In these lengthy military deployments, Americans came to think of these occupied countries as essentially U.S. possessions, much like Puerto Rico and the Philippines. At home, cities denounced both loan guarantees and military interventions as dollar diplomacy. African American leaders also denounced the Haitian occupation. On behalf of the Women's International League for Peace and Freedom and the International Council of Women of the Darker Races, a delegation conducted a fact-finding tour of Haiti in 1926. Their report exposed, among other things, the sexual exploitation of Haitian women by U.S. soldiers. By the late 1920s, dollar diplomacy was on the defensive, in keeping with a broader mood of isolationism and disgust with international affairs. At the same time, political leaders became frustrated with their poor results. Dollar diplomacy usually managed to get loans repaid, securing bankers' profits. But the loans often ended up in the pockets of local elites. U.S. policy had failed to build broad-based prosperity overseas. Military intervention could have had even more dire results. In Haiti, the Marines crushed peasant protests and helped the Haitian elite consolidate its power. U.S. occupation thus helped create the conditions for harsh future dictatorships that Haitians endured through the rest of the 20th century. Okay, let's move on. Our next section is culture wars. By 1929, 93 U.S. cities had populations over 100,000. New York City exceeded 7 million. and the population of Los Angeles had exploded to 1.2 million. The lives and beliefs of urban Americans, including millions of recent immigrants, often differed dramatically from those in small towns and in farming areas. Native-born rural Protestants, faced with dire perceived threat, mobilized in the 1920s to protect what they saw as American values. This anti-foreign sentiment is called nativism. Rural and native-born Protestants started the decade by achieving a long-time goal, which was prohibition of liquor. The nation's decades-long prohibition campaign culminated with Congress's passage of the 18th Amendment in 1917. Ratified by nearly every state and effective in January of 1920, the amendment prohibited the manufacture, sale, or transportation of intoxicating liquors anywhere in the United States. Though widely circumvented in urban speakeasies and other illegal drinking sites, the law remained in force until its repeal in 1933. Defenders hailed it as a victory for health, morals, and Christian values. At the state and local levels, controversy erupted as fundamentalist Protestants also sought to mandate school curricula based on biblical creation. In 1925, Tennessee's legislature outlawed the teaching of, quote, any theory that denies the story of the divine creation of man as taught in the Bible and teaches instead that man has descended from a lower order of animals. The American Civil Liberties Union, the ACLU, which had been formed during the Red Scare to protect free speech rights, challenged the law's constitutionality. It intervened in the trial of John T. Scopes, a high school biology teacher who taught evolution to his class and faced a jail sentence for doing so. The case attracted national attention because Clarence Darrow, a famous criminal lawyer, defended Scopes, while William Jennings Bryan, the three-time Democratic presidential candidate, spoke for the prosecution. The press dubbed the Scopes case the monkey trial. The label referred both to Darwin's argument that human beings and primates share a common ancestor, and to the circus atmosphere of the trial, which was broadcast live over a Chicago radio station. Such conflicts created the climate for a stormy presidential election in 1928. Democrats had traditionally drawn strength from white voters in the South and immigrants in the North. In the 1920s, however, these groups divided over prohibition, immigration restriction, and the Ku Klux Klan. By 1928, the northern urban wing gained firm control. Democrats nominated Governor Al Smith of New York, the first presidential candidate to reflect the aspirations of the urban working class. The grandson of Irish peasants, Smith had risen through New York City's Democratic machine and became a dynamic reformer. But Smith offended many small-town and rural Americans. He spoke in a heavy New York accent and sported a brown derby hat that highlighted his ethnic working-class origins. Middle-class reformers questioned his ties to Tammany Hall. Temperance advocates opposed him as wet. The governor's greatest handicap was his religion. Although Smith insisted that his Catholic beliefs would not affect his duties as president, many Protestant leaders opposed him on that basis alone. Smith, however, proved no match for the Republican nominee, who was Secretary of Commerce Herbert Hoover. Enjoying the benefit of 8 years of Republican prosperity, Hoover promised voters that individualism and cooperative endeavors would banish poverty. He won a major victory, receiving 58% of the popular vote to Smith's 41%, and an overwhelming 444 electoral votes to Smith's 87. All right, so that's it for today. Go ahead and answer your review questions at this time and continue on with your reading and your notes.